130 years ago, if you were looking to get around in New York, there was this. Fast forward about 25 years, and everything had changed. About 40 years ago, if you were looking to take a picture, there was this. Fast forward just 20 years, and everything had changed. About a dozen years ago, if you were looking to light a space, well, there were these. Fast forward to today, and we have these. 3 examples of disruption, really quick disruption. Well, a couple of 100,000 years ago, if you were life in the universe, there was this. Fast forward to today, the blink of an eye in the geologic timeline, and there's this. And everything is changing. Today, there are more of us than ever before, and that's a good thing. And we're consuming more than ever before, and suddenly we're finding ourselves face to face with some pretty significant disruption. Perhaps the biggest disruption of all. A lot of disruption, but among them, perhaps the biggest, climate change, and not far behind its lesser-known cousin, resource depletion. We think about water, perhaps. That's a renewable resource, but also non-renewable resources. For example, when it opened near Bathurst in the 1960s, Brunswick Mine was one of the biggest zinc deposits in the world. But in 2013, it closed. The deposit was depleted. The mine is empty. So we're facing some pretty significant disruption in terms of climate change and in terms of resource depletion, the 2 I'd like to focus on today. And, well, what are we going to do? How are we going to fix those? I'd argue with a little disruption of our own of 2 paradigms of our world. 1, design, the way we make things, and 2, economics, the way we value and buy and sell things. So let's start with design. And for that, I'd like to introduce you to this book, Cradle to Cradle. It's not a new book. It was written in 2002. But I read it a number of years ago, and it was, for me, one of these light bulb moments, an epiphanal experience. Because Cradle to Cradle is all about, well, as the byline says, remaking the way we make things. Because you see, the way we make things in our world right now, well, it's cradle to grave. Because when we want something, we go to a cradle. And in our world, a cradle would be a well, a mine, maybe an ocean, maybe a forest for the resources we need. Then we make the product and we use it, and when we're done, we pitch it. We throw it away, typically. Cradle to grave. But there's an inherent assumption there, then, that there will always be more resources in the cradle. And along the way, too, that means that we don't design for sustainability. Instead, we design for things like convenience and functionality and low cost. But that means then we create products which, by design, aren't very sustainable, aren't very recyclable. And in Cradle to Cradle, the authors refer to the term monstrous hybrids for products that are a mishmash of materials that make them, by design, virtually impossible to separate out into their constituent ingredients and recycle. And the most egregious example, surely, would be electronics. They talk about disassembling a television into its constituent components. Do you know how many ingredients there are in an old television? 4,360. And when you hear that, then you understand why recycling electronics is so difficult and why we have these horror stories of attempted recycling of limited resources, usually in faraway places. Now, it's getting better, it's true, because more electronics companies are designing better, but still we have big e-waste problems. But beyond that, cradle to grave thinking has kind of permeated much more of our design than just electronics. It's in our everyday world as well. Because cardboard is recyclable, plastic is recyclable, but as soon as you combine them, not very easily recyclable unless separated. I guess it's come to the point where we need to see the baguette to believe that it's really in the bag. But unfortunately, along the way, we've transformed recyclable paper into another mini monstrous hybrid. And then we have this, the quintessential Canadian monstrous hybrid. Millions served today yet again. A cardboard cup lined with plastic, which by design is impossible to recycle. And all of this design, of course, creates a mountain of waste, which is a human creation. Because when you think about it, in nature, there is no such thing as waste. Waste is a human creation because nature has a perfect system of recycling. I know this because I grew up on a farm. And out in the pasture, if you saw one of these guys and you watched long enough, invariably you'd see the appearance of some of this. Then if you waited long enough, well, then you'd notice that that slowly disappeared, and in its place, a nice new patch of green grass. And if you were really patient and waited still longer, you'd find a cow would come along and eat it. Nature's recycling. It's perfect. Now, I'm simplifying, of course, but in nature, there is no waste, to which one might say, yeah, but in our world, we recycle too, don't we? Well, kind of. Because if you look at a product like this, for example, you say, well, when I return that, it gets recycled, right? A couple of little catches. One, first of all, only about 30% of our water bottles are returned. But of those 30% that are returned, they don't get recycled into bottles. They get recycled into inferior products, things like carpet, which makes a 10-year stop on our floors on its way to the dump. Or get recycled into things like polyester, some of which probably does belong in a landfill. But you see, it's not true recycling. In fact, it's downcycling into inferior products. And unfortunately, in our world, virtually all of what we call recycling is actually downcycling, with few exceptions. And perhaps the most egregious example would be what we call number 7 plastics, because they're a mishmash of plastic resins that don't fit the first 6 classes. And as a result, they are in of themselves such a mix that in the most cases, when they're collected, they get slid into a landfill after all anyways. So back to Cradle, the authors argue, in an era of diminishing resources, surely we can't keep doing this. We need to eliminate the concept of waste. How? By changing design so that we're not designing cradle to grave, we're designing cradle to cradle. By designing products so that they can be disassembled into their ingredients and reused again, whether technical ingredients like iron or zinc or copper, or natural ingredients that can be composted. Eliminate the concept of waste. So how are we going to do this? I'd suggest maybe with a second disruption, and that is disruption of our economic system. Currently based on supply and demand. Who's got the resources? Who needs them? Who's got the money? How can we move them? Where is it cheapest to manufacture? And that's all great, except economics as we now practice it, I'd suggest, has at least 2 fatal flaws. First, this concept of externalities. And there's a textbook definition right there. But essentially, an externality is something that's available in such limitless quantities that we perceive it to be infinite, and therefore we don't need to put a price on it because it's always there. And when it comes to externalities, the biggest externality of all in economics, it's our global environment. Back in 2014, some authors did a study attempting to quantify the value of all of the free ecological goods and services we get from this world around us. Everything from the water purification services of wetlands to the free pollination services of insects. to the air purification services of forests, or just plain the value of having a stable climate in which we can live and exist and thrive. Their result? The value of all of our ecological goods and services is twice the value of our global GDP. Everything that we consider our global economy, twice the value. And yet, in our current system of economics, that means that stuff is considered free and it's not valued at all into the price of products. So if we have two products on a store shelf, one that has a really dirty environmental footprint, the other, but it's really cheap, and the one right beside it that is very sustainable but might be just a touch more expensive, well, unfortunately, under our current system, we'll always pick the cheap one. We'll always pick the dirty one. Externalities, a weakness of economics, and here I'd suggest is the second, the notion, the myth of perpetual growth in a finite world. Anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. Now, I couldn't say that very nicely, but Kenneth Bolden can, because he's an economist. Well, say no more. Isn't there something inherently wrong about assuming we can continue exponential growth in a finite world? I mean, how many people do you think we could pack into this room before we say no more? Well, confession time to you. A number of years ago, when these things first became clear to me, I thought, the answer is education. Because once everyone knows what the fix is and the right thing to do is, everyone will do it because we've all got a moral compass. Yeah, I hear the snickering out there. A little naive, maybe. Well, I have since discovered that we all have another compass. And in fact, this one is really strong. The needle on this one does not move. It's our money compass. Because we don't brag about buying expensive, we brag about buying cheap. And we always choose cheap. And for that reason, it seems to me that a big fix for a lot of this is price signals. Putting price penalties on behaviors that we don't want and incentives towards behaviors that we do want. And the biggest one of all, of course, is a price signal, a price on carbon. Because if, for example, the emissions from our burning of oil and coal and natural gas are driving climate change, this great disruptor, doesn't it make sense to put a price signal on them? And along the way, when we do that, we make those consumption of those products less desirable, and will also be inherently incenting the energy sources we need to replace those dirty sources. But we can't stop just there either, because really when it comes to price signals, we need to permeate all the way through our current economic system. Because remember the two products? With full cost accounting of all of the impacts of the environment embedded into the product, you know what happens here? This. And suddenly we buy cheap. We transform the market. And you know what happens to expensive products? They disappear. That's the future I think we need. So now you're sitting there thinking, okay, so what can I do about this? Any engineers out there? Because if there are, why not help us eliminate the concept of waste by designing products oriented towards cradle to cradle, not cradle to grave? Any economists out there or aspiring economists, why not help us figure out where we can put price signals so that we transform our world from one based on consumption to one based on sustainability? Any consumers out there? Why not educate ourselves on the right thing to do and then just start making conscious, positive choices? Maybe starting by swearing off of disposable coffee cups and carrying around the mug. Maybe by swearing off of single-use water bottles and carrying our own water bottle. Any voters out there? why not contact your leaders to tell them that this is really important stuff and pledge your support when the time comes for them to make the difficult decisions that will need to be made in order to turn things around. Albert Einstein said, "We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them." My own interpretation of that is maybe we need to rethink everything we hold to be true. Disruptive? Yeah. But maybe that's what it will take to disrupt the greatest disruption of all.